Well, we're going to be in the very last chapter of Genesis today. So we're taking a big jump forward, and we're going to be transitioning into kind of the time of Moses. So we've been in the time of Abraham, right? And that's kind of how the people of God begin. And then that transitions into the time of Moses, which I think is then a perfect transition for us in celebrating Easter. All of this kind of, we see how God has worked throughout history. One thing that I hope that you see as we're going through Genesis is that God is using this group of people not because they are any more special than anyone else, not because they are better qualified, not because they are more skilled, not because they're have a strong army, or that they're politically minded, or anything like that. They're just people that chose to be faithful. That was the beginning. Whenever he chose Abraham was just faithful and listened to God, right? And that starts a movement that literally changed the world. And whether you believe in God or not, if you look historically, the world changed through the people of Israel. I mean, you can make a strong case that this small group of people and what has come from that has completely changed the world, right? And it began with this guy named Abraham, right? So we've been talking about this, and I think I want to kind of hit the timeline. We're obviously going to skip over a lot of historical things that happened, but if you remember last week, Abraham knew that his son Isaac needed a wife, and so he finds his wife Rebekah. Rebekah and Isaac, they have two sons, Jacob and Esau. Remember, and they are twins. Esau comes out first with Jacob holding onto his heel, right? Right? And there's this battle nearly from the beginning, right? And then a lot of things happen with that. Jacob and Esau don't really get along. They're two very different personalities, right? And Jacob actually manipulates. Well, Esau first kind of gives up his birthright. He's like, it's not all that important to me. And so Jacob says, well, it is to me. And he finds a way. He manipulates Isaac at the end, right? Dysfunction is going on, right? We're seeing this. But so Jacob becomes the one that the line is going to go through. Well, he's scared that Esau, his brother, is going to kill him. And so he flees back to the same place where Isaac found his wife, right? And if you remember, we talked about Laban. That was Rebekah's brother. Well, he's still there. Well, now he has a couple of daughters, and Jacob wants to marry Rachel. And so they work out a deal, just as the way that you would normally do it. And Jacob marries who he thinks is Rachel. And Laban says, you know what? Rachel's the younger one. The older one really needs to get married first, so you're married to her. And you can easily marry Rachel, but you have to work another 7 years for me. So this is a 14-year period now that Jacob is working for Laban. And then Laban gets very upset because Jacob makes good decisions business-wise. He's blessed. Things start going well. And so then Jacob realizes, okay, I'm going to have to go. Now, you can imagine having two wives. Problems came up in that family. It's shocking, right? And so there becomes a rivalry between the two wives and which kids, or all of this, just normal stuff. And I think it's important. God is using this group of people, right? But they're not immune to the consequences of their bad decisions, and they certainly don't have enough wisdom to avoid the bad decisions better than anybody else, right? And so God continues to work through that. Through Jacob, he has 12 sons, and the 12 tribes of Israel, which are still very prominent and very important. That's important throughout the rest of the Bible. They come from Jacob's 12 sons. Right? That's where that is established. During this time, Jacob goes back, is going to be reunited with Esau. That's a pretty tense situation. Jacob, it's an interesting time of wrestling with God, right? And this is actually, it's marking the time where God is audibly speaking to people and interacting with people is starting to slow down, right? So Jacob wrestles with God, and he is given the name Israel. And what the word Israel means is to struggle with God, right? Which is so important to understanding our relationship with God, is that it's a struggle. It's not a black and white thing, right? God understands that, one, we're not going to be perfect. And he also wants us to kind of struggle with him. Like, he hasn't created this situation where he's up there and saying, this is the way I want it done, you do it, right? It's kind of a weird deal that the creator of the universe does not treat us like his servants, right? In most other religions, that's kind of the way that it's set up, right? Is that, okay, here's the God, the deity, what they say goes, and it doesn't really matter. Doesn't matter if you understand it, doesn't matter if you care, you just do it, right? And that's how you're judged in your faithfulness. Here, Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel, which is the name of the group of people, the way he gets that name is because he's not just sitting there listening to God. He's wrestling with God. He's struggling with God. Now, this doesn't mean that there's not respect. It doesn't mean that you don't have a strong faith and relationship with God, right? But it does mean, man, God gives us a lot of ability to make our own decisions, and to live with the consequences of those decisions and to wrestle with them. And yet he's present in all of it. And that's what we're really going to see today. And so life continues to go on. So you have Israel now, or Jacob, who has the 12 sons. There's all kinds of stuff that go on. If you want to read from chapter 24, 25 in Genesis to chapter 50, you're going to see rape, sexual assault, revenge for that. You're going to see some incest stuff that, if you do read it, understand some of that is culturally back then. Thankfully, that culture has changed. There's all kinds of crazy stuff that are going on within this family, right? But God is still working. And now all of a sudden, you get to a guy named Joseph. And the more that I've looked at Joseph's life, and the more that we understand and study him, he's a really good example for us to follow. In some ways, even better than David, right? David is a man after God's own heart and did a lot bigger things for the nation of Israel, because right now they're just kind of a nomadic people group right now. But Joseph was one of the first people that the Bible spends significant amount of time telling us about, who never had a direct interaction with God, just like us, right? I'm assuming most in here, we've never had a direct interaction with God, where God has either physically manifested himself before us, or that we have clearly heard the voice of God. Now, that doesn't mean that God doesn't speak to us. That doesn't mean any of that. But that's the normal of how God works now. Well, Joseph, he was in that same boat, right? God never came and spoke to him. But yet, throughout the stories that we hear, he is always talking about God. Well, that would be a sin against God. Well, God wouldn't want me. And then he would attribute things. Well, God has given me the ability to interpret dreams, right? And so it's really interesting, because he, in some ways, shows the strongest and most intimate relationship with God that we've seen up to this point in Genesis. And yet he never had a direct face-to-face encounter with God. And it's really interesting. So it shows you how powerful this relationship and this bond between this people and God has become. right? In spite of all of the craziness that's going on, and that this people group can do some things that you just shake your head at, but God is still working through them. So the story of Joseph goes like this. You've probably heard it. You remember some of it. Joseph was, when he was young, he was probably in his teenage years, could be kind of a jerk, could be kind of arrogant, right? That kind of goes with the territory at that age. But to make matters worse, his father also put a lot of emphasis on him, made it pretty clear that, okay, you other 11 brothers, y'all are okay, but Joseph here, he's the favorite. Right? In fact, he even gave Joseph a nice coat that distinguished him from his other brothers. Right? Not a good parenting move. Right? Just not good. Usually, it doesn't get your son killed, but it does have that potential. Right? So the brothers don't like this. Joseph clearly has a strong relationship with God, even at an early age, and has a lot of wisdom in the way that he is able to interpret dreams and things. And we don't understand all of that, but a lot of it is wisdom. A lot of it is God blessing him and giving him that wisdom. Well, it's kind of interesting, but sometimes that's very offensive to people. People don't like that. They don't like that you're wise, and they take offense to that. And you add on to that the way that the father has treated Joseph as elevating him. It was just a mess, right? And so you have the brothers that are out in the fields, and Joseph is going to check on them, and they plan to get rid of him. It's kind of interesting. Some of them want him dead. Reuben and Simeon. Some of the older ones, they're kind of like, we better not do that. How about let's just selling him into slavery? That's a good option, right? Yeah. So they do that. They sell Joseph into to some slave traders who end up taking him to Egypt. They basically, it's kind of interesting. They don't fully lie to Jacob or to Israel, right? They just kind of put some blood on his coat. And they're like, we found his coat. We don't really know exactly what happened. So there's a lie, but they never actually say that he's dead. But Israel actually assumes that he's dead, right? And it's just this horrible scene where the father has now lost his son. And so we see Joseph ends up being taken to Egypt and sold into slavery. While he's in Egypt, and again, I think it's important. Imagine what that must do to you, right? I mean, talk about horrible, right? Your own brothers, sell you into slavery, and now you're headed off to Egypt, where you're just going to be a piece of property. They're really looking at it realistically and objectively. There's no hope for you, right? I mean, the rest of his life, he went from going to be part of this people of God, right, where he was kind of elevated, maybe even more than he should have been elevated, but he was still elevated, to now going to be a slave for people in Egypt. Man, talk about frustrating, right? And so he ends up being a slave to an official there in Egypt named Potiphar. Interestingly, something that we can learn from is Joseph engaged in that, right? He was like, okay, I'm going to make the best of it. And so he was a great servant. And so he was elevated. It was interesting, the Bible says he was elevated to control basically everything in Potiphar's house except the food, which is an indication of probably some of the dietary restrictions that Joseph and Israel and them, they started practicing, that the Egyptian was like, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to eat pork, whatever it may have been, right? But it was interesting. That's the only thing within the house that he wasn't fully in charge of. So he's running the house, and then of course Potiphar's wife. You remember the story. She takes a liking after Joseph, kind of something that we see happen today, right? It doesn't fit the normal narrative. Usually we think of sexual pressure and stuff like that coming from a man to a woman, which is statistically, obviously, is more likely to happen. But it's a similar situation that we've been dealing with in society now. Someone in power that is trying to use that power to get what they want in a sexual way, right? That's exactly what is happening here. And Joseph, interestingly, he gives a few reasons why he doesn't want to do it. He says that would be against Potiphar. He said that's not appropriate. And he said, and that would be a sin against God, right? So he's holding on to his faith, even though life has not gone well for him, right? And he's holding on to his faith. Well, of course, the situation is manipulated by Potiphar's wife, and she says that Joseph was the one who instigated it, and Potiphar sends him off to the prison. Interestingly, that's probably an indication that Potiphar probably believed Joseph, right? Because if you have a slave who rapes your wife, do you just send them to prison to live, or do you just cut their head off? In that day and time, you would just cut their head off, right? So the fact that Potiphar even leaves Joseph alive is an indication that of the trust and the character that Joseph was living out. And so he goes to prison. Again, can you imagine? You're like, okay, I had made the best of living as a slave, and now I'm in prison, right? But even in prison, he uses his abilities. He uses the gifts that God has given him to help run the jail. So he moves up and given some authority there in jail. Then he ends up having two officials from the Pharaoh come, and they have dreams, and they ask Joseph, hey, what do these mean? And he tells them, and it's good for one of them, it's really bad for the other one, right? And those dreams happen. And Joseph asked the guy, said, the only thing I ask is if you would tell Pharaoh what happened, that I was nice. He's just wanting to get out of jail and go back to being a servant somewhere. Well, of course, the guy forgets, right? I think it was the cupbearer. He forgets. So Joseph is in for another few years. I mean, this is years of time. This isn't like months, right? So Joseph is there, and then Pharaoh starts having dreams, and he's getting all irritated because no one can tell him what it means. And the cupbearer goes, oh, yeah, there's that guy in prison, right? I remember him now. And so that Joseph goes before Pharaoh, is able to interpret the dream. From the beginning, Joseph said, it is not me who interprets these dreams. It is God. It's an amazing show of faith, right? That Joseph is still attributing the good things that are happening to him to God, even though all of the crappy things have been happening to him, right? And Pharaoh listens to that. Pharaoh recognizes the type of person Joseph is and begins to give Joseph some authority, and Joseph becomes where he's a major part of that administration, right? And then famine happens throughout the region, and Joseph's brothers show up, right? And if you remember that story, it is really incredible to kind of read it. And Joseph tests them. He wants to see, have these guys changed, right? And now it's really interesting that he chose to do that. He wanted to forgive them from the beginning, but he also wanted to make sure that they had changed, and they had. Right? They really, there's places where Joseph was overhearing them because they're talking in their native language, thinking that Joseph can't understand them, right? And they talk about, man, we can't let another one of our father's sons die like we did with Joseph, right? And they do show remorse. And so finally, Joseph reveals who he is. He's able to be reunited with his father. The family moves from the promised land, which this is a big and important aspect. So because of this famine, and because Joseph is where he is, the family moves from what we would consider the nation of Israel right now, and moves up to Egypt to be there so that they would have food. And again, this wouldn't just be the immediate family. You're talking about a large group of people already. But that actually sets the stage for what happens with Moses, because that's how the people get to Egypt. Very important aspect. But I want to read, because this is so important, and I know that's a lot of just history, but it's vital that we understand how are we going to choose to view the history of our life? Are we going to choose to view it the way that Joseph does, which is a very healthy way? Or are we going to choose to view it differently? And I want to read, this kind of gives an example of how Joseph views life. And man, we can learn so much from it. So in Genesis chapter 50, starting in verse 15. So this is after now Jacob, or Israel, has now passed away. So the father has passed away, and the brothers get kind of nervous. They're like, well, maybe Joseph was only being nice to us because dad was here, right? Now that dad is gone, maybe he's really going to take out his vengeance. So in verse 15, it says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servant of the God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. So we see early on that probating wills is always kind of a complicated thing, right? Of figuring out, well, what did the person actually say? And, right? So they're nervous, right? And understandably, in that time, retribution was normal. If you hurt somebody, it was just a matter of time before they were going to find a time to hurt you back, right? So that's what they're scared of. But it's interesting, Joseph's reaction is he weeps, because that's not on his radar, right? He's not thinking that way at all. And it says, his brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. It's a really simple response by Joseph, but man, there's a lot there. He said, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Don't be afraid. I really started thinking about that, and man, that is a good way to look at life, right? Because what we're getting into is a little bit of that conversation of free will, right? Of how does free will and how does that work with God, and as we look at what's going on around us in life, right? Because that gets confusing, and it's hard for us to piece that together. And I looked at some Jewish writers and things like that. From what I can tell, most Jewish theologians believe in free will. Believe that is an inherent characteristic that is very unique to us as people, that we have the ability to choose how we're going to act and how we're going to respond, right? And ironically, we kind of all live that way, but whenever it comes to a philosophy, we don't necessarily like that very much, right? We've tended, and even within Christianity, over time, it kind of started out to where it was more free will, but there's a lot that say, no, you know what? That it's not so much. We don't really have true free will. God knows everything, right? And in many cases, well, God actually is the one who is causing things to happen and doing things to happen. The reality is we don't understand. What's interesting now in kind of the modern atheist movement that we're seeing now, the atheist view does not support free will. Like the atheistic view says that is loony to think that you actually have free will. And they come at it from the perspective that we are all just a creation of neurons and protons and firing synapses and stuff like that. And that is what's determining how we're going to respond, right? That we really don't have the ability to change it. We think we do, but we don't really. It's interesting that that's the atheistic view, is that it goes away from free will, right? And we understand that this is a little bit challenging. But I think that Joseph gives a pretty good way to do it, because I do believe we have free will, right? I believe that the way that you choose to live your life matters, right? It really worries me, especially whenever you go off the atheist direction. Basically, that excuses all behavior whenever you carry it out to its logical conclusion. If it's just kind of what's going on inside of us and that's how it works, then no matter what behavior you do, I had no choice, right? That's just how I was made. That's scary. Right? I also don't like a real strict view whenever of limiting free will from a religious perspective. Because, man, it is hard for me to wrap my mind around. I'll be honest, whenever we've lost Molly's mom and sister before the age of 50, are you telling me that God did that intentionally? Man, I can't wrap my mind around that. Maybe so, but I don't think so, right? Well, Joseph gives an interesting perspective. Here is a guy who has every right to be really ticked at God, right? It's like his life has not been easy. And we look at it now and you say, well, he's, number 2 man in all of Egypt. Yeah, that's years and years after being in prison, after being enslaved, being treated unfairly, right? It wasn't an easy path. And at any point, that could have gone a different direction, right? But what Joseph says is really interesting to me, and I think could really help us. Says, 1, don't be afraid, right? But he says, am I in the place of God, right? That's a good thing to recognize. And the answer to that is no. No, you're not in the place of God. We need to be real careful thinking we have it all figured out, right? Real careful with that. And so whenever I'm trying to talk about free will and stuff like that with people, I'm not going to be horribly dogmatic on that, because I don't understand fully how God is doing. I believe that God is engaged. I believe that God can come and directly do things and change things. I don't believe that's the way that he does it all the time, but it is kind of this mix, right? That God sometimes is directly involved, but a lot of times he's kind of trying to push us in the right direction and wanting us to make the right decision. Do you think God really wanted Joseph's brothers to sell him off to slavery? I don't think so. But did that mean when they made that wrong decision that God said, I'm out, I'm done? No, he continues to work, right? And so Joseph recognizes, man, I don't understand all of this. I'm going to say there were nights in his prison cell that he was like, God, what the heck, right? But he gets to that point, he's like, but I'm not God. I'm not going to fully understand all of that. And this next is, and pretty much you have to choose to live this way or not. And it's completely up to you. It says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Right? So what Joseph is choosing to do is he's choosing to say, I don't understand it fully, but you know what? I believe that God is good. Yes. And so as I look at my life, I'm going to choose to believe that God was continuing to work for good, right? And even whenever bad things happen, even whenever the deal with Potiphar's wife happened, you know what? This is my thinking of what Joseph is saying. He's like, well, it's not that God decided I needed another challenge. It's because Potiphar's wife chose to be a jerk, right? And Joseph got caught up in it. And guess what? I think that breaks God's heart. He's like, no, that's obviously not how I want you to be treating each other. But he continues to work in spite of it. And so Joseph is looking and he's saying, yeah, look at all the bad stuff that happens, but I'm going to believe that you continue to work for good no matter what. And that's what I'm going to look for. And whenever it doesn't match that, whenever there's bad things that happen, he says, you know what? I'm not God. I can't fully explain it. But I know it at the heart that God is good. And I see how he continues to work for good. You know, we can get into lots of theological discussions, right? But practically, if you want to live a more faithful, a more joyful life, and this is biblically based, so it's not like you're just pulling this out from somewhere just to make it up. Live your life believing that God is working for the good for you and for others. It doesn't mean it always happens the way that we think it should, but that is what God desires for us. Right? He doesn't desire for us to endure all of the miserable hardship, but that is a result of being in a world that has chosen not to follow God. Right? But that doesn't change the fact that God desires good for you. And so it does come down to that. Are you going to choose to view the world that way? Right? And I love how Joseph says, front end and back end, he says, and then don't be afraid. Right? If you struggle with fear is because we're always focusing on the bad that could happen. What if we start focusing on the good that can happen as a result of the bad? Then you start not to be overcome by fear. Right? It's slow, it's little, it's not a perfect system, but man, it is a different way to view the world. And Joseph lived that way. And look at how he was able to honor God. Right? I think we need to start looking at the world that way. That God is working for the good. Right? He's working for the good of those who love him. That's said in Romans. Right? That is a theme throughout, that God is working and that people make horrible decisions and it makes it a lot harder for God. Right? But he is working for the good of us, and we need to start looking at the world that way. Let's go to him in prayer.